Lecture for November 17, 1960. In our last session I said something about the elements of the doctrine of being as we find them in antiquity. However, in keeping with what I am trying to do here, I did not undertake to present even a rudimentary historical account of the concept of being, but chose instead to discuss the elements which I introduced solely with reference to the problematic of the philosophy of being as we encounter it today. And we shall address the new philosophy of being solely with reference to its continuing relevance, in other words, with regard to whether it is true or is not true, and with regard to the conclusions which such a critique may prompt. But I think I should remind you that the new philosophy of being, these new ontological approaches of the most various kinds, do stand in a quite specific relationship with the old ontologies. The turn which has led to the philosophies of being, as is generally assumed, should indeed probably be traced back not so much to Husserl, the teacher of Schiller and Heidegger, as to Husserl's own teacher Franz Brentano. Now Brentano was originally a priest who came straight out of the scholastic Aristotelian tradition, and his philosophy represents a rather remarkable combination of scholastic ontological themes and issues associated with the tradition of empiricist and Enlightenment thought. And here I would like at least to mention the most important work which in a sense effectively inaugurates this ontological approach, since I know that some of you are certainly interested in the historical origin of these things. Now it is significant that the word origin actually occurs in the title of the book in question, On the Origin of Ethical Knowledge. The work does not attempt to develop the fundamental categories of ethics from some formal principle of reason, but treats them instead as possessed of intrinsic being in their own right, as a form of being sui generis. And the orthodox followers of Brentano, Oscar Krauss in particular, too, argued against Husserl, with some justification, that what phenomenology proclaimed as a completely new turn in philosophy really goes back to the philosophy of Brentano, which is directly bound up with the scholastic and Aristotelian tradition. It was Schiller who took up ontology as initially conceived by Husserl, in no bad sense, merely in terms of certain logical categories, and extended and reoriented it as a so-called material ontology. Schiller was thus the first to introduce the concept of being in itself on the part of substantive intellectual elements, which finally terminated in the concept of being. Now to a significant extent he too was indebted to the Catholic Aristotelian tradition. And the same is true for Heidegger, who also originally intended to become a priest. Thus this entire philosophy is connected in various ways with a theological philosophical tradition which in a certain sense is very different from the later general European concept of the Enlightenment, and which has also maintained its distance from the latter. Nonetheless, in spite of the remarkably ancient and archaic moment which you may say is already involved in this ontological approach, and which has finally been openly confessed in the Heidegger school, you must not overlook the fact that we are not talking simply about a philosophical tendency which remains untouched by the Enlightenment or, more precisely, by critical philosophy. On the contrary, we are talking about a tendency which does indeed take up those earlier themes but has itself arisen out of an entirely new situation. Namely from the situation in which there is something such as autonomous reason, in which, therefore, whatever we say about real or intellectual objectivities of one sort or another, the moment of reflective reason is already inevitably involved. We could say that ontology, in relation to the critical philosophy, in relation to transcendental philosophy in the context of idealism in the broadest sense, has something in common with what certain movements of contemporary philosophy declare themselves to be, namely a form of counter-enlightenment. In other words, this is a thinking which employs the means of autonomous thought and exploits the entire armory of philosophical culture and philosophical critique in order to restore or re-establish a kind of view of the world or a kind of experience which had been dissolved by the Enlightenment and by critical philosophy. It is a kind of thinking, to put this more crudely and more generally, which would use autonomous intellectual means to restore something like heteronomy, just as in the totalitarian political movements of our time we may clearly observe a tendency not to derive forms of heteronomy in simply immediate terms from established relations of a social kind, but to deduce them instead from rational categories which actually presuppose autonomy, as in the concept of elites for example. I shall develop this notion of heteronomy on the basis of autonomy in more detail later on, and all I want to say here is this. What seems utterly impossible to me in all these ontological efforts, impossible in a very weighty sense, not just in the way we easily say today that's impossible, but impossible in a quite objective sense, is precisely the idea of getting back to some position where we are bound by categories replete with being, to being itself, from a position where consciousness is not bound at all. But it will be some time before we come to all this. Here I would just like to say instead that the so-called question of being that we are talking about in these ontological approaches does indeed have a lot to do, substantively speaking, with the older problematic that I spoke to you about last time. This is so even though the question of being, as I shall also show you, is anything but a pre-critical return to naive realism. Even though Heidegger himself has specifically distanced himself from Hartmann, whose turn to ontology is effectively a turn to a very solid or, if you wish, pre-critical realism, 3 and has emphasized that his own existential ontology is not ultimately motivated by the desire, for example, to defend some kind of realism, whether critical or naive, against idealism or the phenomenalism associated with it. The concept of ontology is indeed somewhat complex and ambiguous. And amongst those of you who have not specifically engaged with Heidegger's thought, there will probably be some who take the naive and straightforward view that ontology is precisely a philosophy of being that is simply opposed to a philosophy of consciousness. In other words, that it is a realist philosophy in opposition to one that is grounded in self-reflection. Now there is also something right about that, and we shall return to it in due course. But, since we are trying to address ontology in its most consistent and differentiated form, it must already be said that the conception of so-called naive realism is not what is most decisive here, for the concept of being or being as Heidegger describes it attempts to escape. Whether it succeeds is another question, both from any mere conceptuality and from any reality simply or immediately accepted as such. This double approach, this double front against a philosophy of concepts and against a philosophy of reality, is precisely what characterizes the efforts of ontology in its most rigorous and consistent form, namely its Heideggerian form. And, if I am not mistaken, it owes its very considerable influence to this distinctive double perspective and the wavering character associated with it. I have thus already suggested that, in ontology of the Heideggerian kind, in the most consistent and in a certain sense, by its own measure, most radical form of ontology, we are not dealing simply with the concept of being. And this touches on a thematic that is indeed directly connected with the ancient philosophical tradition. We are talking about ontology as the doctrine of being, and we want to concentrate on this so-called question of being as much as possible, since it really is the crucial point on which this philosophy turns, and since we can do critical justice to the claim it makes only if we really think through this point where everything is finally secured, as Kant puts it and Heidegger's philosophy of being is caught up in a most curious and wavering alternative. For it is by no means clear whether we are talking here merely about the meaning of the concept of being, what the concept of being means when we say the word being, or whether we are talking here directly about being itself. Now the answer we would receive in this connection is undoubtedly the latter. A convinced Heideggerian would immediately object, and would imagine this to be a very powerful objection, that we are indeed dealing with being itself rather than the concept of being. But then we would already encounter certain issues which really have a lot to do with what in modern philosophy we have generally come to describe as the analysis of meaning. Here I should already point out that Heidegger himself, or at least the Heidegger of being and time, expressly confessed his allegiance to phenomenology as a method, and that he regarded himself as a student of Husserl's methodologically speaking. And the phenomenological method of taking up the phenomena of mental life precisely as they are given amounts effectively, to a considerable degree, to the careful analysis and differentiation of meanings. And when you look at Heidegger's texts you will discover just such analyses of meaning all over the place. Indeed, an entire discipline within fundamental ontology, one which plays a very important role there, although its cultural and historical origins point in a rather different direction, namely to Dialectics, actually consists precisely in the analysis of meaning, namely the much-discussed discipline of hermeneutics. 5 Now, if you think about Aristotle, we find that the question we were just talking about, whether we are concerned with being or the concept of being, is in one sense put very simply. This is because, for Aristotle, language is quite simply the guiding thread by which we can make something out regarding being. The expression kappa alpha tau eta gamma omicron rho alpha, categoria, or category, itself signifies nothing more than in accordance with speech. And if you wish to characterize Aristotle's metaphysics in a very crude way as a doctrine of categories in an admittedly metalogical sense, that is, in a material rather than a merely formal sense, then you would find that all the categories that Aristotle provides, a list which, as you all know, is taken over in the Critique of Pure Reason with a few modifications as the relevant categories plus the forms of intuition 6, simply comprise the totality of syntactic forms already identifiable through an analysis of language in Aristotle's time. In other words, the pure forms of speech themselves are supposed to be the forms that also say something about being itself, without explicit reflection on the difference between language and object being required. Now we could say that one of the decisive steps which has shaped modern thought since Bacon, and the whole movement of Western nominalism in particular, consists in the fact that this canonic character of language is no longer recognized. Reflection on the difference between language and its object did eventually emerge, and in a certain sense critical thought is nothing but the investigation of this difference between language and object, namely, to employ the classical expression which Kantian philosophy has lent to this problem, the attempt to explore the possibility of concepts themselves rather than simply philosophizing from concepts. And this possibility, this reflection on the possibility of concepts, in Kant means nothing other than reflection on the fundamental sustaining relationship between the concepts and their object, that is to say, on their meanings. In this way language is actually displaced from its once dominant and unchallenged position. In this sense the refusal to think in terms of mere concepts, the critique of rationalism, is actually one with the critique of scholasticism insofar as it is implicitly but essentially a critique of language. Indeed the word nominalism implies as much, since it treats concepts as mere noumena for what they designate rather than as something substantial, as a kind of being in itself. Let me say that the concept of being also belongs amongst the hypostases of language, inasmuch as a method which believes that every typical and exemplary linguistic state of affairs we can accomplish must also possess a corresponding objectivity of its own, and actually proceeds in a hypostasizing manner, irrespective of whether we are dealing with a mental state of affairs or some factical or empirical state of affairs. The linguistic form which is supposedly substantiated in the concept of being is the copula. 7 The copula is simply nothing but the is and the predicative judgment A is B. It is this is which is commonly called the copula. And the concept of being as we find it in Aristotle in the first instance is nothing more than this. When we investigate the state of affairs that is supposed to stand behind these linguistic forms, then the state of affairs which is also supposed to stand behind the is just being dash, just as in grammar in epsilon nu alpha iota, in I, or in nu, on, stands behind the copula sigma tau iota, st, or is. To that extent, the concept of being, in terms of its origin and its legitimacy, is also directly bound up with the categorical structure of language. In one sense, therefore, this entire tradition hypostasizes concepts by tacitly assuming that some constitutive state of affairs must also correspond to everything which is constitutive for language. And being has also largely fallen victim here through the process of philosophical critique. As I believe I have already pointed out, Kant has formulated this in a particularly emphatic manner in his Amphiboly chapter, where he says that concepts of reflection, concepts which have no immediate application whatsoever since they are essentially posited merely by consciousness in general, are treated as if they possessed intrinsic being in their own right. As far as this question is concerned, Heidegger's new ontology basically proceeds in a similar way, and indeed precisely by appealing to Husserl's method, which holds that philosophy can essentially be grounded through an analysis of meanings. And Heidegger's ontology, as I said before, is to a large extent founded in the theory of meaning, even though this is not entirely the case. Now I think it is time that I should try, with you, to get closer to the problem we are talking about here through a rather more specific analysis regarding the concept of being, although I would ask you at first not to press me too much if, in what I am saying, I do not distinguish strictly between being and the concept of being. I believe that you will soon understand why this alternation between these two ways of speaking is so extraordinarily difficult to avoid. In order to understand the possibility of the ontological approach in an emphatic manner, you must clearly realize that this word being involves a very specific problem which does not arise in the same way with other concepts. Thus, if we simply tried to apply the critique of concepts of reflection or the critique of rationalist conceptual dogmatism to the concept of being, we would really be making things all too easy for ourselves, or celebrating a great and joyful triumph when, as is so often the case with such triumphs, we have simply occupied a battlefield on which our opponent is nowhere to be found. In other words, and I apply this warning to myself as well, you must by no means make things too easy for yourselves in this critique of the concept of being, for there is indeed something quite distinctive with regard to this being. On the one hand, it is impossible to speak about being directly without reference to the concept of being. Sometimes, when we find ourselves in this sphere, we must, in order to expose its own triviality, be ready to descend into the sphere of triviality ourselves. We cannot actually avoid this, since here in particular the most extreme triviality and the most extreme insight exist together in a most remarkable symbiosis that needs to be teased apart somewhat. Thus when I say the word being, when I speak about being or think being, then this is not indeed being itself. And the thought that I have in this connection, what I mean here, is not immediately the same as being, for it is mediated by the word. And this word, I do not believe I need to expand on this, just think about the copulate that I mentioned to you earlier. This word is not of course something isolated but is an element of language, something that could not be characterized at all outside the context of language. It thereby mediates what is meant, what is to be said, with language itself. We are presented here with a mediation of being, as I tried to suggest before in genetic terms by reference to the history of philosophy. I spoke of the extent to which the concept of being was due to abstraction, to the transition from more specific Croce alpha, RK, to principles of an ever more general character. The word being is not being, for there is something else between what we say and what we mean. And to that extent we can say that what we talk about is conceived in terms of something, it is itself a concept. We cannot get round this conceptual dimension. With the word being we think something that is not being itself, for otherwise it would be precisely the kind of immediate revelation that we do not have. Yet this very word being also points towards thought, if I may put it this way. Here, incidentally, you can readily understand the tremendous significance which belongs to language and the idea of language in Heidegger's philosophy, a significance which I would certainly also be inclined to ascribe to language, albeit in a rather different way. And it is a significance, I might add, that the most extreme counterposition to the Heideggerian school, namely logical positivism, especially in the case of Moore but to some extent also in Wittgenstein, ascribes to language as well. We could even say that so-called neopositivism is distinguished from good old positivism in the style of Mach and of Nereus precisely by the way it no longer talks simply of the immediately given or the context of the given but has come to see that the given itself is not ultimately immediate, since in thinking about it we are already treating it as something linguistically mediated. Thus if we really wish to reach the so-called ultimate data, we are still reliant on language, and this explains the extraordinary importance of protocol sentences for positivist philosophy. 10 Thus, with regard to this thematic of language as a constitutive dimension of philosophy, I would say that this is by no means limited to modern ontology since it is essentially involved in all philosophical reflection, and that philosophy that is not also philosophy of language is not even conceivable today. I emphasize this here since it is only on the basis of this admission, of this shared conviction, that we will be able to understand the very real differences which I shall try and unfold for you in relation to Heidegger's own philosophy of language. Now, on the other hand, and this confirms what I said about the distinctive character of the word being, where I would certainly not challenge Heidegger's view, for the word being reminds us of that which is not exhausted in a merely subjectively instituted concept, in other words, of what was described in the language of ancient and archaic philosophy, in the Ionian philosophies of nature, with a relatively unusual expression, as pi omicron kappa epsilon mu epsilon nu omicron nu, hypokomnon, as that which underlies. The concepts that we employ all have something instituted or superimposed about them, as they say in English, something foisted upon things. They basically serve the domination of nature and are generally acquired more scientifico, through a process of definition, in accordance with scientific procedure. And they are retained as long as they confirm these so-called definitions, without decisively touching what they refer to. They are mobilized as chips or counters and deployed for technical ends, in the broadest sense of the word, although what they mean does not actually find expression in language here. This is something that has often been recognized by philosophy. I would simply remind you historically that Hegelian philosophy rests upon the idea that every individual concept is false, or that there is no actual identity between any finite concept and what it is meant to designate. It does indeed designate it, but in being imposed on the heterogeneous by the subject it also always differs from what the thing is in its own right. And the driving force of the whole Hegelian philosophy is an attempt to make good this difference, to produce that identity between thought and thing, between subject and object, which is bankrupted by every individual concept, precisely through the totality of the developed system as a whole. In a less emphatic way, though one that is therefore also much easier to grasp, Nietzsche expatiated at length in a relatively early piece on the philosophy of language upon the incommensurability of concepts and things. 11 And Nietzsche's irrationalism, if we can really put it like that, the priority of life over spirit which Nietzsche himself proclaimed, finds its ultimate epistemological justification in the recognition that concepts are inadequate to the living reality they would encompass, that all that is living, as people repeat ad nauseum, is mortified and life perishes in the medium of concepts. Now this moment of inadequacy is removed from every individual concept and finds itself indefinitely postponed, as it were. We do not reflect thoroughly upon any individual concept as it is usually deployed, unless we think dialectically, which certainly cannot be presupposed here, to see how far this concept is fully adequate to its object. Yet we will still have some awareness of this inadequacy in the background, as it were, and will finally transfer this awareness to the totality or to that ultimate concept which stands behind it. Thus in Kant, for example, this will be the highest concept of all those objectivities which are not exhausted in our concepts of them, namely the concept of the thing in itself, that transcendent unknowable thing which certainly stands in some obscure relation to the particular knowledge and thus to the concepts we do have, yet is supposed to be unreachable as such. It would do no violence to Heidegger's thought, and I believe he himself would not particularly object, if we claimed that the position of the concept of the thing in itself in Kant's transcendental philosophy bears an extraordinarily close relationship with that dimension of being that, as Heidegger believes he has shown, eludes conceptuality. The peculiar thing about the concept of being lies in its twofold character. On the one hand, it is a concept, the comprehensive concept not only of all beings but also of every idea, of every essence, or the ultimate concept, the concept par excellence. On the other hand, it is also an expression of the opposite. It is a non-concept insofar as it is meant to identify, retain and preserve what cannot for its own part, in principle, be conceptual. In other words, it is the concept which is the intrinsically contradictory concept capital Xi omicron chi nu, kaksoshin, the concept as anti-concept. It is both at once. And this is what motivates, to return to the thought expressed earlier, the distinctive significance of the philosophy of language in Heidegger. Perhaps I may just repeat here something that I have already mentioned in various contexts during these lectures. And this is that you will find it helpful for comprehending difficult philosophical theses if you understand the thoughts and concepts that arise in these philosophies in a functional manner, or, to put this even more bluntly, if you understand the cui bono question. Here I am not thinking specifically of social interests or the like, for example, but quite simply of the function which thoughts and concepts possess in the overall philosophical structure or edifice itself, in other words, of what the concepts are meant to be good for. Thus the idea of language not merely as a semantic or signifying structure that serves to express beings, but as a realm in which, Heidegger constantly assures us in his later writings, being itself allegedly resounds, is something that emerges precisely from that distinctive double character of being. For on the one hand, of course, being qua concept is referred to language, since being is a word. On the other hand, however, being is just what cannot be expressed through mere meanings, inasmuch as it cannot be exhausted in conceptual terms, or, let me put this more precisely, inasmuch as it points towards what is not exhausted by concepts, what is cut off from concepts. And Heidegger tries to deal with the whole thing by immediately conceding that language does indeed mean or signify, while claiming at the same time that language itself is something other, something more, than meaning in this sense. 12 Now this peculiar construction of language in Heidegger, which is ultimately there only to do justice to this double character of being as concept and anti-concept, allows you to recognize, in a nutshell, the structure which actually gives shape to this entire philosophy. That is why I have already drawn attention to this aspect at this point, to the way in which contradictions such as that of concept and anti-concept, or the concept of the non-conceptual, are not actually unfolded or developed, and the way in which we find, instead, an attempt to master these contradictions by a kind of sorcery, by magically invoking or summoning them through the word. Now the difference, if I may anticipate the basic theme of these lectures, between dialectical thinking and fundamental ontological thinking, considered from this perspective, is just this. Fundamental ontological thinking remains with such contradictions, believes them to be overcome through the immediacy of the word of language, whereas dialectical thinking takes up the challenge that is harbored by these contradictions and attempts to unfold the contradictions themselves. Let me simply add here that there is certainly also a truth moment to Heidegger's conception of language as something which is not simply exhausted by what it means. The problem is that he absolutizes this moment in a one-sided way in relation to being and emphasizes the mimetic moment of language 13, as we would call it, in a one-sided way over against its semantic moment. He thereby brings the dialectic to a standstill in the very sphere which gives the dialectic its name, precisely in the sphere of language which, ex definition, is nothing other than a delta iota alpha lambda gamma epsilon sigma theta alpha iota, Dialectics. Lecture 5.